Today we're going to talk about the top-of-the-line Pontiac wagon for 1973, and that is this beautiful 1973 Grand Safari. Now, Pontiac had a number of wagons for 1973. The Grand Safari sat at the top of the lineup. It was the ultimate in luxury wagons. One below that, if you still wanted a full-size wagon, was the Catalina Safari. And then, of course, there were mid-size wagons like the Le Mans Safari. But the Grand Safari was really the ultimate Pontiac wagon for 1973. And this one is a seemingly good example that was sold on Bring a Trailer not all that long ago. But first, a little bit about the history of the Grand Safari. Pontiac reintroduced an all-new full-size vehicle lineup for 1971 that would continue on through 1976. And part of that new lineup was the range-topping Granville when it came out in 1971. Kind of a melange of the Grand Prix and the Bonneville in terms of nomenclature, hence the Granville. Now, the Granville wouldn't stay atop the Pontiac lineup for too many years. It would fall to the Bonneville Brome name in the mid-1970s, as I guess it was a bit of a failed experiment. But the wagon, the top-of-the-line wagon, would become known as the Grand Safari, and relatively grand it was during this time frame. Now, this was the time frame during which General Motors was producing their so-called clamshell wagons, which ran from 1971 to 1976, and they were called the clamshell because out back, as you can see here, they had a glass, a movable pane of glass that would move into the roof. And then the tailgate, or what you'd normally think of as the tailgate, the rear door would drop underneath the body. So you'd have a perfectly open space to load your cargo. On all of the clamshell wagons, the upper portion that was glass was power operated. You had to power operate that into the roof or lower it. But on some of the clamshells, the tailgate was manually operated. You can tell the manually operated tailgates because they have a handle on them for somebody to help pull them up. They also have little tangs around the keyhole which serve as the release to unlock the tailgate in order for it to drop down. But you have to have the glass up, I think like 4 or 5 inches before it will allow you to drop the tailgate into the floor on the manual tailgate versions. Now, this one that you see here is a power-operated tailgate. This is a pretty loaded Grand Safari, complete with power seats and automatic climate control, as well as the power-operated tailgate, as I mentioned before. But let's cycle back to the front end of this car for a moment because there's quite a bit of history here, and I wanted to mention a few things. The first is, notice the Grand Safari actually shares the Granville's up front grill that spills out underneath the headlights. That was a different grill than you would find on the Bonneville, for instance, or the Catalina. It gave it a little bit more character. It was a more finely textured grill on the Granville and Grand Safari than the Bonneville and Catalina. You do have some trademark Pontiac forms here, like that so-called arrowhead front end. Now, it doesn't come to a perfect point. That point is blunted, I think, largely because of the bumper impact standard here, which reduced the ability for designers to really accentuate that plan view angle of this vehicle, or view from a bird's eye view above. And again, it kind of blunted it because you had to have this huge hang-on bumper up front. And you'll notice here that someone has replaced the midsection, I think that's urethane, that fills the gap between the bumper and the grille. Needs to be painted for whatever reason. Whoever did that didn't have it painted. But 1973 was the first year for the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard up front, and unfortunately these Pontiacs really suffered tremendously in the looks department because of it. Although I do think it's still kind of handsome. You just can't really stare at it from above because the bumper looks more cartoonish than ever from that angle. But I will say, despite that, there is some beautiful surfacing to this front end. I love kind of the very gradual fillet that forms the pocket in between the hood and the fender tip. I think that's just well done. And then the way that that form kind of comes out from the hood, the Pontiac arrowhead, I guess, for lack of a better term. I do love the crease that runs down the middle of it. Again, just some slight fillets on either side of that. And I just think overall the designers did a pretty nice job from a modeling perspective of this front end. I do like how the grille spills out underneath the headlights too. Clearly that's helping accentuate the overall width of this vehicle. And it's kind of humorous because this does have the typical Pontiac split grille that was common to almost all Pontiacs post 1959, but it's done in a very muted way, almost like it was done as an afterthought, like the designers wanted to have that grille go all the way across unbroken. But you got to have that brand characteristic for Pontiac, don't you? Now let's shift to the side view, and there's a couple interesting things that I'll point out here. First is obviously the faux wood grain. This was a holdover from the real Woody wagons of decades earlier, and I guess people just thought it was appropriate to wagons, and a lot of the upper trim wagons of the time had this faux wood grain. It does, I would say, look tasteful. It's maybe not the best looking, but I can understand it in the context of the time. Then you have these kind of interestingly squircle wheel arches that are not quite circular, not quite square. Don't know what to make of them. They look interesting. They're different. I guess that's perhaps what Pontiac's designers were going for. Notice the roof has a raise to it over where the rear passengers sit. This allowed more headroom for those passengers, and in particular because the rear seat on this Grand Safari and on these clamshell wagons actually faces forward. We're going to see in a minute when you take a look at the third row seating position why that was probably necessary, and it's an interesting seating position on these vehicles. So GM on the clamshells, as opposed to having the rear seat, the rearmost seat face rearward, had them face forward. Ford obviously had the seats facing sideways and kind of at each other in the last row. Now, another thing that you'll notice about this wagon is its, well, let's just say very long wheelbase. And interestingly, when you got a GM wagon of the era, like this clamshelled Pontiac wagon, it rode atop 127-inch wheelbase. You got the big wheelbase, not quite the largest wheelbase, not the Cadillac wheelbase, but the big senior luxury car size wheelbase that was used on vehicles like the Olds 98 and Buick Electra, for instance. If you had instead decided to procure a Mercury Colony Park wagon, which would have been the top-of-the-line wagon that Ford offered, you actually got the short wheelbase, the 121-inch wheelbase. So a Mercury Colony Park wagon is actually shorter in overall length than a Mercury Marquis, as an example, sedan or coupe, believe it or not. The wagon is shorter than either of those. Whereas on the GM vehicle, the wagon is longer than all but the senior luxury cars because it has the longer wheelbase, especially when you think of a Chevy Kingswood Estate as an example. So GM and Ford had differing philosophies on what to employ for the wheelbase on their wagons. You can also see the beautiful wraparound glass, that huge glass pane in the back that almost forms what appears to be visually one continual piece of glass. It just kind of wraps backward from the C-pillar around where there would normally be a D-pillar, but there's just a very thin one that forms the outer edges of the glass that would raise into the roof for the rear opening, and then it continues along the side. I think that's just a particularly beautiful element of these wagons. You can also contrast the rear bumper and how close it is. Look at how close it is set to the body versus the front bumper that we were discussing before. That's because in 1973, there was not a 5 mile per hour impact standard in the rear. It was just in the front. 1974 would bring about the rear impact standard in both the front and rear, and you'd see larger bumper offsets on both the front and rear of the vehicles in that particular model year. Now, as we rotate inside, take a look at this interior, and the Grand Safari shared a similar seat stitch pattern and design as the Pontiac Granville, and also similar door panels with very thick faux wood applique on the upper portion of the door panel there behind the pull strap and surrounding the pull strap. This interior was new for 1973. An interior designer named Blaine Jenkins had moved from the Oldsmobile Interior Studio over to Pontiac, and he started doing more luxurious interiors in Pontiacs, beginning with the luxury Le Mans that came out for 1972, something you never really thought you'd see on a Pontiac, a luxury Le Mans. It just was not in keeping with Pontiac's performance image. But Pontiac General Management knew in this time frame that performance was basically dead because of the impending emission standards, and they were going to have to pivot their image to something different. They were not going to be successful selling performance in this era where emissions just made a significant difference and was something that engineers had to care about. And so they pivoted toward luxury. And really, these 1973 interiors in the Pontiac Grandville and Grand Safari were the first interiors that took that luxury to the next level and tried to push Pontiac more upmarket in the lineup to give the buyer more value for their dollar. Now, take a look here at the second row and third row seating in this Grandville. You'll notice that that diamond pattern continues in both of these rows, interestingly. The second row even has this embossed, I don't know what you want to call that design. You can tell that this really was a Blaine Jenkins interior, and he came from Oldsmobile Studio, because think about the interiors on the 1968 Oldsmobiles with these intricate designs, and then also the button tufting from the 1972 Olds 98 Regency, although it was not in this diamond pattern. But that was a signature of many of his interiors, including the 67 Tornado that added buttons to the interior versus the 1966 Tornado. But take a look at the rear seating position here. You're basically sitting over top of the rear axle. Now, it's good because you're facing forward. I think that would be my preferred position, at least in wagons. I never cared to sit facing rearward. It was always annoying when somebody was accelerating. You kind of feel like you're leaning forward continuously. But notice the pockets where you would put your feet. That's because you're sitting over top of the rear axle in these wagons. And, well, you needed that extra headroom. Remember the bump in the roof? To make sure that you could sit back there comfortably. And you got the leg room because your legs were ahead of the rear axle and you sat atop it. Now, I wonder what the ride was like on these. These did go to leaf spring rear suspensions from Coil Springs on the previous generation wagon. I do think they rode relatively well, but I'm not quite sure that I would want to be sitting over top of the rear axle. I guess it doesn't matter all that much, but, well, hopefully they were isolated from at least the road shocks. And I think you were, because this was obviously a body-on-frame vehicle versus a unibody. And here we have one of the luxury features of the 73 Grand Safari, and that is the automatic climate control. Automatic climate control, you say, in 1973? Yes, in fact, GM was the first to introduce automatic climate control to domestic automakers. And it was introduced in 1964 on Cadillacs. Cadillac would have a one-year exclusive before you could get it in other division products. Now, it was still relatively rare in 1973 to see this on Pontiac and Chevrolet, but you could get it in Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. And it was a pretty good setup. It was quite luxurious. It not only selected the outlet temperature, but also the fan speed and the airflow where it was coming from. Later setups would actually get cheaper and less sophisticated. And as an example, they would just control the outlet temperature and not the fan speed or the mode door. So this was a good setup. It was relatively complicated. Remember, there's no computers here and you're executing automatic climate control, but kind of neat. And now let's finish off in the underhood department. This Grand Safari has the 455 cubic inch, 215 horsepower V8. Unfortunately, the 455s by this point were starting to get relatively detuned, aside from the Super Duty Pontiac V8 that was still pretty hot. But the normal 455s were losing power and had been ever since 1971, when the compression ratios were lowered. 1970 was the first year for the Pontiac 455. It would last through the 1976 model year before being discontinued. In fact, after 1976, there really weren't too many Pontiac V8s that were left at that point. The most popular one being the 301. Pontiac would later introduce a 265 cubic inch V8 that would just be around for 1980 and 1981. The 400 did soldier on for a number of years, but even that would be put out to pasture in the late 1970s. Now, while this 455 did have just 215 horsepower, it did have 350 pound-feet of torque, which isn't great, but it's not horrible either. And if you drive one of these, they do have a fair amount of scoot when you're just kind of going around town. If you're trying to pass somebody, though, at relatively higher speeds, they just don't have the same grunt as the 1970 455, as an example, has. If you've got a 1970 Pontiac, while I don't necessarily care for the looks, the engine is great, and they are fast. They are really, really peppy. But here you've got something that's torquey, at least, and it motivates this Grand Safari, I would say, just fine, especially for the era. Hope you enjoyed this video on this 1973 Grand Safari. What do you think of this clamshell wagon? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.